The wind screamed across the Arizona territory like a banshee, driving snow horizontally through the darkness. It was the kind of storm that killed everything it touched, turning the high desert into a frozen wasteland where nothing could survive. Ben Carter pulled his coat tighter as he stumbled through knee-deep drifts toward his barn, the lantern in his hand casting wild shadows that danced and flickered in the howling gale. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. 3 years of living alone on Copper Creek Ranch had taught him that storms like this either broke you or made you stronger. And tonight felt like the kind that might finally break him. The barn door groaned against the wind as he wrestled it open, ice crystals stinging his weathered face. His cattle huddled together in the far corner, their breath creating clouds of steam in the frigid air. But it wasn't the sight of his livestock that made him freeze in place. It was the small bundle tucked against a hay bale near the door. At first glance, it looked like nothing more than discarded rags, maybe something blown in by the storm. But then it moved just slightly, and Ben's heart nearly stopped. A baby, wrapped in what appeared to be animal hide and cloth, so small it could have been a doll, lying motionless in the hay. Ben dropped to his knees, his hands shaking as he reached for the bundle. The child's lips were blue, skin pale as morning. Frost, but when he pressed his ear close, he could hear the faintest whisper of breath. Alive, but barely. Without thinking, he scooped the infant against his chest, feeling how terrifyingly light and cold the little body was. Who would leave a baby out here to die? The nearest neighbor was Jake Morrison, 15 miles east, and Jake would sooner shoot an Apache on sight than help one. The thought hit him like a physical blow. Apache, the child's features, the style. Of the wrapping, the beadwork he could see peeking through the folds, it all pointed to one impossible truth. Someone had left an Apache baby in his barn during the worst blizzard in 20 years. Ben Carter had never wanted to be the kind of man who lived alone with nothing but ghosts for company. But grief had a way of making choices for you. 3 years ago, he'd been a different person entirely. A husband and soon-to-be father who believed the future stretched out before him like a golden promise. Sarah had been heavy with their first child when the fever came through the territory, sweeping through settlements like wildfire. The doctor in Millfield had called it influenza, but Ben knew better. It was death itself, pure and simple, taking everything good from the world and leaving behind only emptiness. Sarah had fought for 2 weeks, burning with fever while their unborn son fought his own battle inside her womb. Ben had held her hand through every hour of delirium, whispering promises about the life they would build together, the children they would raise, the ranch that would become a legacy. But promises meant nothing to disease. Sarah had died on a Tuesday morning in October, and their son had followed her into darkness before the sun set. Ben had buried them both under the oak tree behind the house, marking their graves with stones. He'd carved himself, and then he'd stopped talking to God altogether. The ranch had become his prison and his salvation all at once. During the day, he threw himself into the work with a fury that scared even him, mending fences that didn't need mending, moving cattle from pasture to pasture with no real purpose, except to keep his hands busy and his mind occupied. At night, he sat by the fire with a bottle of whiskey, telling Sarah about his day as if she were still there to listen. The neighbors had stopped coming around after the first year, understanding that some wounds were too deep for casseroles and awkward condolences to heal. Now as he carried the frozen infant toward his house, Ben felt something stirring in his chest that he hadn't experienced in 3 years. Fear, yes, but also something else. Purpose, maybe, or simply the desperate need to save something when he'd failed to save the 2 people who'd mattered most. The baby made a sound, barely more than a whisper, and Ben quickened his pace, his boots crunching through the snow as the wind tried to knock him sideways. The ranch house sat dark and cold, looking more like a tomb than a home. Ben rarely bothered lighting more than one room anymore, seeing no point in heating space for just himself. But tonight, he kicked open the door and immediately set about building up the fire in the main room, adding log after log until the flames roared with life. The baby hadn't moved since he'd picked him up, and that terrified him more than the storm outside. Ben had helped deliver calves and foals, had seen newborn animals struggle for their first breaths, but he'd never held a human infant before. His own son had been born dead, never drawing air into his lungs, never crying or moving, or showing any sign of the life that should have filled him. This child was different, still breathing but so close to death that Ben could almost see the line between life and whatever came after. He unwrapped the baby carefully, his rough hands gentle despite their size. The infant was a boy, probably 6 months old, with dark hair and features that confirmed Ben's suspicions about his heritage. Someone had dressed him in traditional Apache clothing, tiny moccasins and a shirt decorated with intricate beadwork that must have taken weeks to complete. These weren't the clothes of abandonment, Ben realized. These were the clothes of love, of a mother who had dressed her child with care and attention to every detail. The baby's skin was still dangerously cold, but as Ben held him close to the fire, he could see color slowly returning to the small face. He needed warmth, food, and medical attention. But the nearest doctor was in Millfield, and no one was traveling anywhere in this storm. Ben would have to figure this out on his own, the same way he'd figured out everything else since Sarah died. He heated water on the stove and used clean rags to warm the baby's hands and feet, rubbing gently to encourage circulation. The infant's eyes fluttered open briefly, dark and unfocused, before closing again. Ben had no idea what babies were supposed to eat, but he remembered his own mother feeding orphaned lambs with milk and a rag twisted into a makeshift nipple. He had cow's milk in the cold cellar, and it would have to do. As he worked, Ben found himself talking to the child the same way he talked to Sarah's grave, a low murmur of conversation that filled the silence and kept his hands steady. "You're going to be all right," he said, though he wasn't sure he believed it. "Whatever happened to you, whoever left you out there, you're safe now. I don't know much about babies, but I know about surviving, and that's what we're going to do." The baby managed to take a small amount of milk, most of it dribbling down his chin, but enough to give Ben hope. Color was definitely returning to the small face, and the breathing seemed stronger. Ben wrapped him in one of Sarah's quilts, the one she'd been working on for their own child, and settled into the chair by the fire with the infant cradled against his chest. Outside, the storm continued to rage, but inside the small house, something had changed. For the first time in 3 years, Ben wasn't alone with his grief. He had someone depending on him, someone who needed him to be stronger than his sorrow. The baby stirred against his chest, making soft sounds that weren't quite cries, and Ben felt tears on his face that had nothing to do with the cold. "I couldn't save them," he whispered to the sleeping child. "My wife, my son, I couldn't save either of them, but maybe I can save you. Maybe that's why you're here." The fire crackled and sparked, casting dancing shadows on the walls where Sarah's things still hung exactly as she'd left them. Her apron on the kitchen hook, her book stacked neatly on the table, her rocking chair positioned to catch the morning light. Ben had left everything unchanged, turning the house into a shrine to his lost life, but now he wondered if maybe it was time to let some light back in. The baby's breathing had settled into a steady rhythm, and his skin felt warm to the touch. Ben allowed himself to relax slightly, though he knew the real challenge was still ahead. Morning would bring questions he couldn't answer and decisions he wasn't prepared to make. What did you do with an Apache baby in Arizona territory, where most settlers viewed the native population as enemies to be driven out or destroyed? How Did you explain finding a child in your barn without making yourself a target for every hothead with a gun and a grudge? But those were tomorrow's problems. Tonight, Ben Carter sat by his fire with a baby sleeping against his chest, feeling more alive than he had in 3 years. The storm outside seemed to be losing some of its fury, the wind no longer howling quite so fiercely against the windows. Maybe the worst of it was passing, Ben thought. Maybe the worst of everything was finally passing. He dozed fitfully in the chair, waking every few minutes to check on the baby, to add wood to the fire, to listen for sounds that might indicate someone was approaching through the storm. But the night remained quiet except for the wind and the occasional pop of burning wood. The baby slept peacefully, his small fist curled against Ben's shirt, trusting in a way that broke Ben's heart and mended it at the same time. When dawn finally came, gray and cold through the frosted windows, Ben realized he'd been given something he hadn't dared hope for: a second chance. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Not to replace what he'd lost, that was impossible, but to find a new purpose in the wreckage of his old life. The baby was stirring now, making soft, hungry sounds, and Ben carefully prepared another feeding of warm milk. "Morning, little one," he said, surprised by how natural the words felt. "Looks like we both made it through the night." The baby's eyes opened wider this time, focusing on Ben's face with an alertness that seemed almost adult. For a moment, they stared at each other in the growing light, man and child, two survivors of different kinds of storms. Then the infant made a sound that might have been contentment, and Ben smiled for the first time in longer than he could remember. Outside, the snow had stopped falling, and pale sunlight was beginning to filter through the clouds. The storm had passed, but Ben Carter knew that his real journey was just beginning. Somewhere out there was someone looking for this child, someone who had loved him enough to dress him in beautiful clothes and care for him through the first months of his life. The thought should have filled Ben with dread, the knowledge that he would eventually have to give up this unexpected gift. Instead, he felt only determination. Whatever came next, whoever this child belonged to, Ben would make sure he was safe and healthy when that reunion happened. It was the least he could do, the only thing he could do to honor the trust that had been placed in his hands by a storm and fate and maybe something larger than both. The baby finished his milk and fell back asleep, and Ben carried him to the window to look out at the transformed landscape. Everything was white and pristine, as if the world had been scrubbed clean and given a fresh start. Maybe that's exactly what had happened, Ben thought. Maybe they'd both been given a fresh start, and now it was up to him to figure out what to do with it. The second day brought visitors Ben hadn't expected and didn't want. He was feeding the baby another careful portion of warm milk when he heard the sound of horses approaching through the snow. Multiple riders moving fast despite the treacherous conditions. Ben's stomach tightened as he recognized the voice calling out from his front yard. "Ben Carter, you in there? We need to talk, Jake Morrison." Ben cursed it under his breath and quickly wrapped the baby in Sarah's quilt, carrying him to the bedroom and settling him in a dresser drawer he'd hastily lined with blankets. The makeshift cradle wasn't perfect, but it was hidden and warm. The baby had been growing stronger by the hour, his cries more vigorous, his appetite increasing. Ben had started calling him Tommy in his mind, though he knew the child probably had a real name already. "Coming," Ben called back, grabbing his rifle from above the fireplace more out of habit than any real intention to use it. Jake Morrison was trouble on the best of days, and these weren't the best of days. Ben opened the door to find 5 men on horseback, their faces grim beneath ice-crusted beards. Jake Morrison sat his horse like a man who owned the world, his pale eyes scanning Ben's property with obvious suspicion. Behind him were the Fletcher brothers, Tom and Jim, along with old Pete Hawkins and a man Ben didn't recognize, someone young with the hard look of a professional gunfighter. "Hell of a storm," Jake said conversationally, though his tone carried an edge that made Ben's hand tighten on his rifle. "Lost some cattle in it. You?" "Few heads scattered," Ben replied carefully. "Haven't had time for a full count yet." Jake nodded as if this was reasonable, but his eyes never stopped moving, taking in every detail of Ben's yard. The tracks in the snow, the smoke rising from his chimney. "Funny thing, though. We've been tracking some Apache through this area. Trail went cold in the storm, but they were definitely headed this way." "Haven't seen any Apache," Ben said, which was technically true. He'd found a baby, not seen anyone leaving or approaching. "Course, you'd tell us if you had," Jake continued, and now his voice carried a clear threat. "Wouldn't want to be harboring any hostiles, especially not after what happened to the Patterson place last month." Ben knew about the Patterson place. A family of 4 killed in their beds during what the territorial authorities called an Apache raid. But Ben also knew there were plenty of white men in the territory who'd kill a family and blame it on the Apache to avoid suspicion. Jake Morrison wasn't above such tactics, and everyone knew it. "I said I haven't seen any Apache," Ben repeated, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at his gut. In the bedroom, he could hear Tommy starting to fuss, the soft sounds that preceded a full-blown cry. Ben coughed loudly to cover the noise, stepping forward to block the doorway more completely. "Mind if we take a look around?" the stranger asked, speaking for the first time. His voice was soft but carried the kind of authority that came from being very good at violence. "Just to be thorough." "I mind plenty," Ben said, raising his rifle slightly, not pointing it at anyone, but making it clear he was prepared to use it. "This is my land, and I don't recall inviting any of you onto it." The tension stretched between them like a taut wire. Ben could see Jake calculating odds, weighing the cost of pushing this confrontation against whatever benefit he might gain. Behind him, the Fletcher brothers were fingering their weapons, but Pete Hawkins looked uncomfortable, like a man who'd gotten swept up in something he wasn't sure he supported. From the bedroom came a sound that made Ben's blood turn to ice. A baby's cry, clear and unmistakable in the cold air. Every man in the yard went still. Jake's eyes narrowed, and he leaned forward in his saddle like a hunting dog catching a scent. "That sounded like a baby, Ben. Thought you didn't have any family left." Ben's mind raced. He could deny it, claim it was a cat or some other animal. But these men weren't fools. They'd heard what they'd heard, and now they'd want answers. Tommy's cries were getting louder, more insistent, and Ben knew he had seconds before this situation spiraled completely out of control. "Found him yesterday," Ben said finally, the words tasting like ashes in his mouth. "During the storm, nearly frozen to death. Apache baby?" Jake asked, and his hand moved to rest on his gun. Ben nodded slowly. There was no point in lying now. Couldn't just let him die. The stranger smiled, but it was the kind of smile that made Ben think of wolves. "Well, now that's interesting. Very interesting indeed." Jake dismounted, his boots crunching in the snow as he approached Ben's porch. "Step aside, Ben. We're going to have a look at this baby." "No," Ben said, simply bringing his rifle up to waist level. "You're not." "Don't be stupid," Jake said, his voice hardening. "That's an Apache baby you're harboring. Property stolen from decent white folks, most likely. Maybe even one of the Patterson children, taken during the raid." "The Pattersons didn't have any babies," Ben said. "And this child is Apache, not white. I can tell the difference." "Maybe so," the stranger said, still smiling that cold smile. "But the fact remains, you're harboring a hostile. That makes you a traitor to your own kind." Tommy's cries were reaching a crescendo now, the sound of a hungry infant who wanted attention and didn't understand why it wasn't coming. Ben could feel sweat beading on his forehead despite the cold, could feel the weight of 5 sets of hostile eyes boring into him. "The baby stays with me," Ben said firmly. At least until I can get into town, find out if anyone's looking. For him. Oh, someone's looking for him all right, Jake said. Apache woman came through Morrison's place 2 days ago, bold as brass, asking about a missing child. Tom Morrison ran her off with a shotgun, but she'd be back. They always come back. The words hit Ben like a physical blow. Someone was looking for Tommy, his mother, most likely searching desperately through hostile territory for her missing child. The image of a woman braving men like Jake Morrison in her search for her baby made Ben's chest tight with emotion he couldn't name. Then we wait for her, Ben said. Return the child to his rightful family. Jake laughed, but there was no humor in it. Return him? Ben, you've been alone too long. That baby's got Apache blood, which means he's going to grow up to be a warrior who'll kill white settlers. We do the merciful thing here and now, save ourselves a lot of trouble down the road. The meaning was clear, and Ben felt his finger tighten on the rifle's trigger. You'll have to go through me first. Don't think it won't come to that. The stranger said softly, but maybe there's another way. Maybe you could have an accident, Ben, house fire perhaps. Tragic loss of a grieving widower and an Apache baby. These things happen during harsh winters. The threat hung in the air like smoke, and Ben realized he was truly alone here. These men weren't just planning to take Tommy. They were planning to kill them both and make it look like an accident. The isolation that had been his refuge for 3 years had become a trap, with no neighbors close enough to hear gunshots or see smoke. Tommy's cries suddenly stopped, and in the silence that followed, Ben could hear his own heartbeat thundering in his ears. Then came a new sound, soft but unmistakable. Footsteps in the snow, approaching from behind the riders. Every man in the yard spun toward the sound, hands moving to weapons, and Ben felt his breath catch in his throat. Walking toward them through the snow was a woman, moving with the fluid grace of someone completely at home in the wilderness. She was young, probably in her 20s, with long black hair braided down her back and dark eyes that missed nothing. She wore traditional Apache clothing, beautifully made and decorated with intricate beadwork, but over it all she'd wrapped a thick blanket against the cold. Most striking of all was the way she moved. Not like someone approaching a group of armed men who might kill her on sight, but like someone who owned the ground she walked on. Her posture was straight, her expression calm, and when she spoke, her English was clear and unaccented. "I have come for my son," she said simply. The silence stretched for what felt like an eternity. 5 armed men on horseback, one isolated rancher with a rifle, and an Apache woman who just walked into what could easily become a massacre. Ben could see Jake's hand hovering over his gun, could see the stranger's eyes calculating angles and distances. Well, Jake said finally. "Looks like Christmas came early this year." Maria Yazzie had been tracking the men who took her son for 18 days across some of the harshest country in the Arizona territory. She'd followed their trail through arroyos and over mesas, through snow and bitter wind, sustained by nothing more than jerky and water, and the absolute certainty that she would find her child or die trying. The baby's name was Small Bear, given to him by her father in a ceremony when he was 3 months old. But these white men wouldn't care about Apache names or Apache ceremonies. To them, he would be just another hostile to be eliminated, another problem to be solved with violence. She'd lost his trail during the blizzard, but she'd known the men were heading toward the settlements, toward the scattered ranches that dotted the valley. She'd checked each one methodically, staying hidden, watching, listening for any sign that her son might be nearby. At most places she'd found nothing. At Jake Morrison's ranch, she'd found men who'd tried to kill her on sight, forcing her to flee into the rocks and wait for another opportunity. But here, at this isolated ranch, with smoke rising peacefully from its chimney, she'd heard something that made her heart leap with hope and terror. The sound of a baby crying. Her baby, she was certain of it. A mother knew her child's voice like she knew her own heartbeat. Now she stood in the snow facing 5 mounted men and one who might be her ally or another enemy. The rancher with the rifle looked older than the others, with sadness in his eyes that she recognized. She'd seen the same look in her own reflection after her husband died fighting the cavalry. It was the look of someone who'd lost everything and was still trying to figure out how to keep living. "I have come for my son," she repeated, her voice steady despite the fear coursing through her veins. "He was taken from our camp 18 days ago. I have trapped him here." "Awful long way to come for nothing," Jake Morrison said, his hand still resting on his gun. "Especially since there's no Apache baby here." Maria's eyes flicked to the rancher, saw something in his expression that gave her hope. Guilt, perhaps, or simply human decency. Whatever it was, she knew this man had her child. "His name is Small Bear," she said, speaking directly to the rancher now. "He has a birthmark on his left shoulder, shaped like a crescent moon. He was wearing clothes I made for him, decorated with blue and white beads in the pattern of the morning star." She saw recognition flash in the rancher's eyes, saw his grip tighten on his rifle. Her son was here, alive, and this man had been caring for him. The knowledge flooded through her like warm water, and for the first time in 18 days, she allowed herself to hope. "Nobody asked you to come here, woman," the stranger said, his voice soft and dangerous. "Would have been smarter to stay with your people, mourn your lost child, and move on with your life." "A mother does not move on from her child," Maria replied, "just as the mountain does not move on from the sky." "Pretty words," Jake said. "But words don't change facts. And the fact is, you're trespassing on white man's land, claiming ownership of property that ain't yours." "My son is not property," Maria said, and for the first time, her voice carried an edge of anger. "He is my blood, my heart. The man who cares for him now understands this. I see it in his eyes." All attention focused on Ben Carter, who stood on his porch holding a rifle and looking like a man caught between loyalty to his own kind and something deeper, more fundamental. Maria could see the struggle playing out on his face, could see him weighing the cost of doing what was right against the cost of defying these armed men. From inside the house came the sound of renewed crying, and Maria's heart clenched with a mixture of joy and desperate need. Small Bear was hungry, probably frightened, certainly missing the comfort of his mother's arms. She'd been tracking him for so long that hearing his voice again felt like a miracle and a knife wound all at once. "He needs to eat," she said, speaking to Ben directly. "I can hear that he is hungry. I can feed him, care for him properly." "Apache tricks," the stranger said dismissively. "Could be any baby in there. Could be a white child she's trying to steal back to her people. Could be you're full of horse shit," Ben said suddenly, his voice carrying a strength that surprised everyone, including himself. "I know what I found, and I know what's right." The words hung in the frigid air like a challenge. Maria saw Jake Morrison's face darken with anger, saw the stranger's hand move closer to his gun. These men had come here planning violence, and they weren't going to leave without it. "Ben," Jake said, his voice deceptively calm, "you're making a mistake here, a big one. This woman is Apache, which makes her an enemy. That baby, Apache, or not, is going to grow up to kill white folks if he lives long enough. You're not just harboring hostiles. You're helping them breed." "He's 6 months old," Ben said flatly. "He's not breeding anything, and he's not killing anyone. He's just a baby who nearly froze to death, and I wasn't about to let that happen." "Soft heart's going to get you killed, Ben," the stranger observed, "along with anyone fool enough to help you." Maria understood that the talking was almost over. These men had made their decision before they'd arrived, and nothing Ben or she could say would change their minds. They'd come here to kill her son and anyone who stood in their way, and they were just looking for an excuse to begin the slaughter. but they'd underestimated her. They saw an Apache woman alone against 5 armed men and assumed the outcome was predetermined. They didn't know that she'd been trained by her father, who'd fought cavalry and cavalry-trained Apache scouts, and had lived to teach his daughter everything he'd learned. They didn't know that she carried a knife that had never missed its target, or that she could move through snow as silently as shadow. Most importantly, they didn't know that she was fighting for her child, which made her more dangerous than all 5 of them combined. The baby's cries grew louder, more insistent, and Maria saw Ben glance toward the house with obvious concern. The sound was pulling at him, demanding action, and she could see him starting to make a decision that would change everything. "I'm going to feed him," Ben said finally. "All of you can wait out here in the cold, or you can ride on, your choice." "That's not how this works," Jake said, dismounting from his horse with deliberate slowness. "That's not how any of this works." The other men followed suit, boots crunching in the snow as they spread out in a rough semicircle. The stranger stayed mounted, his position giving him a clear view of all the angles, his hand now openly resting on his gun. "Last chance, Ben," Jake said. "Hand over the baby and step aside. Let us handle this Apache problem the way it should be handled." Ben's answer was to raise his rifle to his shoulder, the barrel pointing directly at Jake's chest. "The baby stays with me until I can return him to his mother. That's final." Maria felt a surge of respect for this grieving rancher, who was willing to risk everything for a child that wasn't his own. She'd been prepared to fight alone, to die alone if necessary, but now she had an ally. Not much of one, perhaps just one man with a rifle against 5 with guns, but it was more than she'd dared hope for. "Together then," she said quietly, her words meant for Ben alone. He nodded slightly, never taking his eyes off Jake Morrison. "Together." The words seemed to trigger something in the men facing them. Hands moved to weapons, horses shifted nervously, and the air itself seemed to hold its breath. Maria could feel the violence building like pressure before a thunderstorm, inevitable and devastating. From inside the house, Small Bear continued crying, the sound of an innocent child caught in the middle of hatred and greed, and the kind of brutality that had been tearing the territory apart for decades. But this time, Maria thought, this time would be different. This time, her son had protectors who wouldn't abandon him to the wolves. The question now was whether any of them would survive long enough to see him grow up. The standoff lasted exactly 37 seconds before Tom Fletcher made the mistake that changed everything. Maria had been counting heartbeats, measuring distances, calculating angles of attack when the younger Fletcher brother decided to circle around toward the side of the house. His boots crunched too loudly in the snow, his movement too obvious, too aggressive for anything but hostile intent. Ben's rifle swung toward Tom, and that was all the excuse Jake Morrison needed. "Take them!" Jake roared, his hand flashing toward his gun, but Maria was already moving. She'd palmed her knife during the conversation, holding it concealed against her wrist, and now she sent it spinning through the cold air with deadly precision. The blade took Jake in the shoulder, spinning him around and dropping him into the snow with a howl of pain and surprise. Ben's rifle cracked, the sound sharp as breaking wood in the thin air. Tom Fletcher stumbled backward, clutching his thigh where the bullet had torn through muscle and bone. His scream joined Jake's, creating a chorus of pain that scattered the horses and sent the remaining men diving for cover. Maria rolled behind Ben's woodpile as bullets began flying, chunks of split oak exploding around her head. The stranger on horseback was trying to control his mount while drawing his weapon, cursing as the animal reared and fought the bit. Pete Hawkins had taken cover behind the water trough, his old cavalry training evident in the smooth way he'd found protection, and returned fire. "How many shells you got?" Maria called to Ben, who was crouched behind his porch railing. "Enough," he called back, working the lever of his rifle to chamber another round. "You hit?" "No, you?" Not yet. Jim Fletcher was dragging his wounded brother toward the barn, leaving a trail of blood in the snow that looked black in the pale morning light. Jake Morrison was trying to reload his pistol one-handed, the knife still protruding from his shoulder. The stranger had finally gotten his horse under control and was methodically putting bullets into the woodpile, forcing Maria to stay low. "This ain't over," Jake yelled, his voice thick with pain and fury. "You're dead, Ben. You and that Apache woman both." "Big talk from a man bleeding in the snow," Ben replied, and sent another bullet whining past Jake's head to emphasize his point. The baby's cries from inside the house were getting more frantic, the sound cutting through the gunfire like a blade. Maria could hear the desperation in Small Bear's voice, the confusion and fear of an infant who didn't understand why his world had suddenly become filled with violence and terror. "I have to get to him," she said, and Ben heard the anguish in her voice. "Too much lead flying," Ben replied. "Wait for them to reload. He's scared. He needs his mother." Ben understood that feeling, that desperate need to comfort someone you loved when the world was falling apart around them. He'd felt it with Sarah during her final hours, the helpless frustration of being unable to take away her pain. "On my signal," he said, "I'll give you covering fire." Maria nodded, gathering herself into a crouch. The stranger's horse was dancing sideways, giving her a narrow window of opportunity. Pete Hawkins was hunkered down behind the trough, but his angle wouldn't let him see the front door clearly. Jake was still bleeding and cursing, more focused on his wound than his weapon. "Now!" Ben shouted, rising from cover to pour rifle fire toward the mounted gunman. Maria sprinted across the open ground like a deer, her moccasins silent on the snow despite her speed. Bullets whined around her, kicking up sprays of white powder, but none found their mark. She hit the front door at full speed, shouldering it open and diving inside as wood splinters exploded from the frame where a bullet had just missed her head. The sudden silence inside the house was deafening after the gunfire outside. Small Bear's cries filled the space, coming from what must be the bedroom. Maria followed the sound, her heart hammering against her ribs, and found him wrapped in a beautiful quilt and a makeshift cradle. "She, little one," she whispered in Apache, gathering him into her arms. "Mother is here. Mother is here now." Small Bear's cries immediately quieted to sniffles as he recognized her scent, her voice, familiar comfort of her embrace. Maria felt tears streaming down her face as she held him close, checking him over for injuries or signs of illness. He was thinner than when she'd last seen him, but alive and alert and beautifully, perfectly whole. "Thank you," she whispered, to the absent rancher who'd saved her son's life. "Thank you for keeping him safe." Outside, the gunfire had slowed to occasional shots, men conserving ammunition and testing for weaknesses. Maria could hear Ben calling out challenges and threats, trying to sound stronger than one man with a rifle had any right to sound. She needed to get back out there, needed to help him, but first she had something to do. She unwrapped Small Bear from the quilt and quickly examined the clothes Ben had dressed him in. They were white man's clothes, warm and practical, but not the traditional garments she'd made for him. Those were folded neatly on a nearby chair, carefully preserved by someone who understood their importance. Maria quickly changed Small Bear back into his Apache clothing, whispering prayers of gratitude to her ancestors as she did. The blue and white beadwork caught the light from the window, each tiny bead placed by her own hands during the long winter nights before his birth. Seeing him wearing them again felt like reclaiming a piece of her heart. A bullet shattered the bedroom window, showering glass across the floor. Maria shielded Small Bear with her body, then quickly moved him to the safer main room. She could hear Ben reloading his rifle on the porch, the metallic sounds of someone running low on ammunition. "Ben," she called. "I'm going to try to get around behind them." "Too dangerous," he called back. "They'll see you coming." Not if you keep them busy. Maria had spotted something the attacking men had missed, a root cellar door at the back of the house, almost completely hidden by drifted snow. If she could get into the cellar with Small Bear, she might be able to work her way around to the barn and catch the Fletcher brothers from behind. She wrapped Small Bear tightly against her chest in the style of her people, securing him so that her hands would be free for fighting. He seemed to understand the need for silence, his dark eyes solemn as he watched her face. "Listen to me, little warrior," she whispered. "We are going to play a game now. A very quiet game where you must not make any sounds at all. Can you do that for Mother?" Small Bear blinked once, as if nodding, and Maria felt a fierce surge of pride. Her son was strong, just as his father had been strong, just as her father was strong. He would survive this, and he would grow up knowing that his mother had fought for him when the whole world seemed set against them. The root cellar was dark and cold, filled with the earthy smell of stored potatoes and preserved meat. Maria moved through it carefully, feeling her way toward what she hoped was an exit near the barn. Small Bear remained perfectly quiet against her chest, his tiny fist gripping her shirt. She found a wooden ladder leading up to another door, this one barred from the inside. Maria listened carefully before lifting the bar, hearing Jim Fletcher's voice somewhere close by. "Tom's hurt bad," Jim was saying. "We need to get him to a doctor." "Shut up and keep shooting," came the stranger's voice. "That Apache woman's in the house now. We burned them out. This whole thing's over." Maria's blood chilled. Fire was the one thing Ben couldn't fight with his rifle, the one weapon that would force them out into the open where superior numbers would tell. She had to act now before they could implement their plan. The cellar door opened into a small storage room attached to the barn. Maria could hear the horses moving restlessly in their stalls, spooked by the gunfire. Tom Fletcher was propped against a hay bale, his face gray with pain and blood loss, while his brother tried to tend to his wound with obviously inadequate medical skills. Maria drew her backup knife, a smaller blade she kept for close work, and prepared to end this quickly and quietly. But as she stepped into the barn, Small Bear chose that moment to make a soft cooing sound, and Jim Fletcher's head snapped around toward the noise. "Well, hello there," he said, his hand moving toward his gun. "Look what we have here, Tom. The Apache woman and her little papoose come calling." "Shoot her," Tom gasped through gritted teeth. "Shoot them both and be done with it." But Jim Fletcher was smiling now, the kind of smile that made Maria's skin crawl. "Now why would I want to do that? Seems to me we've got ourselves some valuable bargaining chips here. That soft-hearted rancher might be willing to talk sense once he knows we've got what he's trying to protect." Maria measured the distance between them, calculated her chances of reaching Jim before he could draw his weapon. Small Bear was still pressed against her chest, still vulnerable to any gunfire that might erupt. She needed to be smarter than these men, not just faster. "You are bleeding men," she said calmly. "Your friend Jake has a knife in his shoulder. Your brother will die without proper medical care. Perhaps it is you who should consider bargaining." Jim laughed, but there was an edge of hysteria in it. "Lady, you are in no position to make threats. We've got the guns, we've got the numbers, and now we've got you. Do you?" Maria asked and smiled. That was when the barn doors burst open and Ben Carter charged through them like an avenging angel, his rifle at his shoulder and death in his eyes. He'd worked his way around the building while Maria had kept the Fletcher brothers distracted, and now he had them caught in their own trap. "Drop your weapons," Ben commanded, his voice steady as granite. "Both of you right now." Jim Fletcher's hand was still hovering over his gun, his eyes flicking between Ben's rifle and Maria's knife. Tom was in no condition to fight, slumped against the hay bale and struggling just to stay conscious. "You can't watch all of us at once," Jim said, but his voice lacked conviction. "Try me," Ben replied. The moment stretched like a bowstring, taut with potential violence. Maria could feel Small Bear's heartbeat against her chest, could smell the hay and horses and blood that filled the barn. Outside, she could hear Jake Morrison shouting orders that no one was following, Pete Hawkins calling for a retreat, the stranger cursing as his horse fought the bit. "It's over," she said quietly. "Your friends are running. Put down your gun and tend to your brother. Let this end here." Jim Fletcher looked at his wounded brother, at Ben's unwavering rifle, at the Apache woman who'd somehow outmaneuvered all of them. Slowly, reluctantly, he raised his hands. "We'll remember this," he said. "All of us. You're marked now, Ben Carter. You and that woman and her baby. This territory ain't big enough for all of us. Then maybe some of you should consider leaving." Ben replied, "Because we're not going anywhere." The words surprised Maria almost as much as they seemed to surprise Ben himself. "We're not going anywhere." As if the three of them were already a family, already a unit bound together by something stronger than circumstance. Small Bear chose that moment to make another soft sound, not crying but commenting on the world around him in the way babies did. The sound seemed to break the tension in the barn, reminding everyone present that at the center of all this violence was an innocent child, who deserved better than the hatred of adults. "What's his real name?" Ben asked, looking at Small Bear with something like wonder. "Small Bear," Maria replied. "But you have been calling him something else, yes?" "I heard you talking to him." Ben's face flushed slightly. "Tommy, I've been calling him Tommy." Maria considered this, looking down at her son's solemn face. "Small Bear," she said, then added, "Tommy Small Bear. He can carry both names, both worlds." It was a small thing, a gesture of reconciliation between cultures that had been at war for generations. But in that moment, in a barn filled with the smell of hay and blood and the promise of peace, it felt like the beginning of something larger, something that might just be strong enough to survive in a territory where hope was as rare as water in the desert. Outside, the sounds of the retreating riders grew fainter as Jake Morrison and his remaining men chose discretion over continued violence. The immediate danger was over, but Maria knew it was only temporary. Men like Jake Morrison didn't forgive or forget, and they would be back. But that was tomorrow's problem. Today, she had her son back in her arms, and she had found an unlikely ally in a grieving rancher who'd chosen to do what was right instead of what was easy. It was enough. For now it was enough. The silence that followed the departure of Jake Morrison and his men felt strange and fragile, like the quiet after a thunderstorm when you weren't sure if more weather was coming. Ben stood in his barn doorway, rifle still in his hands, watching the distant figures disappear into the white landscape. His ears were ringing from the gunfire, and his hands shook slightly from the aftermath of violence. Behind him, Maria was tending to Tom Fletcher's leg wound with a competence that surprised both Ben and the injured man himself. She'd sent Jim Fletcher to gather clean water and cloth, treating him like a chastened child rather than someone who'd been trying to kill her minutes earlier. "Hold still," she told Tom, her voice calm and professional. "The bullet went through clean, but you will have infection if this is not properly cleaned." Tom Fletcher stared at her with a mixture of confusion and grudging respect. "Why are you helping me? I was trying to shoot you." "Because you are hurt, and I know how to heal," Maria replied simply, as if the logic were obvious. "My grandmother taught me the medicine ways. A wound does not ask who made it before it decides to heal." Ben watched this exchange with something approaching awe. Here was a woman who'd just fought for her life and her child's life, now calmly providing medical care to one of her attackers. It spoke to a strength of character that went beyond mere survival instincts. "You should probably get him to Doc Richardson in Millfield," Ben said. "That leg needs more attention than we can give it here." Jim Fletcher nodded gratefully. "We'll do that. And Ben, I want you to know this wasn't my idea." Jake's got a way of making things seem necessary when maybe they're not. Jake Morrison's got a way of making good men do bad things, Ben replied. Question is what you're going to do next time he comes calling. Jim looked at his brother, pale and weak from blood loss, then at Maria as she finished bandaging the wound with strips torn from her own clothing. Maybe next time I'll be too busy to hear him calling. It wasn't an apology exactly, but it was something. A recognition that lines had been crossed, that some things couldn't be undone or justified by tribal loyalties or territorial politics. After the Fletcher brothers had departed, riding slowly toward town with Tom slumped over his saddle horn, Ben and Maria stood in the sudden quiet of his ranch yard. Small Bear was nursing contentedly, wrapped in Sarah's quilt, seemingly untroubled by the violence that had swirled around him. Thank you, Maria said finally, for protecting him, for protecting us both. Thank you for getting us out of that mess, Ben replied. I was running low on ammunition and ideas both. You could have given him to them, she pointed out. It would have been easier, safer for you. Ben was quiet for a long moment, looking out at the snow-covered pastures where his cattle were starting to emerge from their shelter, drawn by the return of peace to investigate the disturbance. I had a son once, he said finally, for about 10 minutes. Long enough to hold him, to see that he had Sarah's nose and my stubborn chin. Not long enough for much else. Maria said nothing, sensing that this was something Ben needed to say. In his own time, in his own way. When I found Tommy in my barn, it wasn't about Apache or white or any of that. It was about a baby who needed help, and I was the only one there to give it. Ben's voice carried the weight of 3 years of isolation and grief. I couldn't save my own son, but maybe I could save yours. Maria shifted Small Bear to her other arm, studying Ben's weathered face in the pale afternoon light. She could see the pain there, old and deep, the kind that never fully healed, but learned to live alongside hope. Your wife, she said gently. What was her name? Sarah Elizabeth Carter. The name came out like a prayer, spoken with the reverence of someone who'd said it countless times to an empty house. She would have loved him, you know. Would have fussed over him something fierce. She sounds like a good woman, the best. Ben's voice cracked slightly. She always said this place needed the sound of children laughing. Guess she got her wish, even if not the way we planned. They stood in comfortable silence for a moment, two people who understood loss in different ways, but with equal depth. Small Bear made soft gurgling sounds, contentment replacing the fear that had filled his cries during the gunfight. He has grown strong with you, Maria observed. I can see it in his face, his movements. You have cared for him well. Ben felt a flush of pride mixed with something he couldn't quite name. Didn't really know what I was doing. Just tried to keep him warm and fed and safe. That is everything a child needs, Maria said. Food, warmth, safety, and someone who cares whether they live or die. You gave him all of these things. The simple acknowledgement hit Ben harder than he'd expected. For 3 years, he'd felt like a failure at the most basic human tasks, unable to protect the people who'd mattered most to him. But this Apache woman was telling him he'd succeeded at something important, that his clumsy efforts at baby care had actually made a difference. He's beautiful, Ben said, really looking at Small Bear for the first time without the urgency of crisis surrounding them. Got your eyes. And that determined set to his jaw. That's all you two. Maria smiled, and it transformed her face completely. The fierce warrior who'd fought alongside him became a young mother proud of her child, radiant with the simple joy of having him back in her arms. He gets his stubbornness from his father, she said, and from his grandfather, who was the most stubborn man in all the Apache nation. When Small Bear decides he wants something, he will not give up until he gets it. Sounds like he'll fit right in around here, Ben said. Stubborn seems to be a requirement for surviving in this territory. The comment hung between them, carrying implications neither was quite ready to examine directly. Maria looked around at the ranch, taking in the solid construction of the house and barn, the well-maintained fences, the signs of a man who took pride in his work despite his grief. "This is a good place," she said. "Peaceful, protected." "It can be lonely," Ben admitted. 3 years of talking to myself and the cattle gets to a man after a while. In my culture, we believe that loneliness is a sickness that can only be cured by connection, Maria said. Not just to other people, but to purpose, to something larger than ourselves. "What's your purpose then?" Ben asked. Maria looked down at Small Bear, then back at Ben. "To raise my son to be a good man. To teach him both worlds, Apache and white, so he can choose his own path. To make sure he knows love, not just from me but from others who see him as more than his blood or his skin." "That's a tall order in this territory," Ben said. "Most folks around here don't see past the surface." "Most folks perhaps, but not all." Maria met his eyes directly. "You saw a baby who needed help, not an Apache child to be feared. That gives me hope that others might see the same way." Small Bear began to fuss, and Maria automatically began the gentle swaying motion that mothers everywhere use to soothe their children. The gesture was so natural, so practiced, that Ben felt a pang of envy for what he'd never had the chance to learn. "He's hungry again," Maria said. "Growing boys always are. I've got some cow's milk inside, been heating it for him. Not sure if it's what he's used to, but it seemed to work." Maria laughed, a sound like water over stones. "He has been drinking cow's milk? No wonder he has grown so strong. Apache babies usually nurse much longer." "I figured that out pretty quick," Ben said, his face reddening. "Had to come up with something, and that was all I had. You did well. Better than well." Maria's expression grew serious. "Ben, I need to ask you something important. Those men who came here today, they will be back. Perhaps not tomorrow, perhaps not next week, but they will return. And when they do, they will bring more men, more guns. Staying here puts you in danger." "I'm not leaving," Ben said immediately. "This is my home. Sarah's buried here, and our son. I'm not running from Jake Morrison or anyone else. And Small Bear? What happens to him when they return with 20 men instead of 5? When they decide to burn down your house with all of us inside?" Ben was quiet for a long moment, the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders like a lead blanket. She was right, of course. His isolated ranch that had been a refuge was now a target, and continuing to shelter Maria and Small Bear would bring more violence down on all of them. "There might be another way," he said slowly. "Doc Richardson in Millfield, he's a good man, got no use for Jake Morrison's type of politics. Might be willing to help, especially if someone came to him with a hurt baby." "You want me to take Small Bear to the town doctor?" Maria asked, her voice carefully neutral. "I want us to take him to the town doctor," Ben corrected. "Together, let folks see that we're not hiding anything, that this is about a child's welfare, not some conspiracy." Maria studied his face, searching for something she could trust. "And after that? What happens when the doctor has seen to Small Bear's health? Do I disappear back into the mountains while you return to your lonely ranch?" The question hung between them like a bridge neither was sure they should cross. Ben felt the weight of 3 years of isolation pressing against the possibility of something he hadn't dared hope for: family, purpose, a reason to care about tomorrow. "I don't know," he said honestly. "I'm not good at planning beyond the next day anymore. Lost that skill when I lost Sarah, but I know I don't want to go back to the way things were before I found him, before I found both of you. My people will not understand if I stay among the whites," Maria said. "They have seen too much betrayal, too much violence. To them, you would be just another white man who will eventually turn against us. And the whites around here won't understand if I take up with an Apache woman," Ben added. They'll see it as betrayal of my own kind. So we would both be outcasts, Maria observed, belonging fully to neither world. Maybe that's not such a bad thing, Ben said. Maybe it's time to build something new, something that doesn't depend on old hatreds and old fears. Small Bear had fallen asleep in Maria's arms, his tiny fist curled against her chest. He looked so peaceful, so trusting, that it seemed impossible to imagine him as the center of such conflict and violence. He deserves better than to grow up caught between two worlds at war, Maria said softly. Then maybe it's up to us to find him a better world, Ben replied. Or build one ourselves. The sun was beginning to set, painting the snow-covered landscape in shades of gold and pink. Ben's cattle were moving slowly back toward the barn, following routines established over years of careful management. Everything looked normal, peaceful, but both Ben and Maria knew that the peace was fragile, temporary. Tonight, Maria said, we should leave for town tonight, while the trails are still passable. Those men will expect us to wait, to plan, to act cautiously. They won't expect us to move immediately. Ben nodded. Makes sense. Doc Richardson's always said folks could come to him any time, day or night. And traveling at night will keep us away from prying eyes. Can you ready your wagon? Something with good wheels for the snow. I've got a sleigh Sarah and I used for winter trips to town. Haven't used it in 3 years, but it should still be sound. As they began making preparations for the journey, Ben found himself moving with more purpose than he'd felt since Sarah's death. There were supplies to gather, harnesses to check, plans to make. For the first time in years, he was thinking about the future instead of simply enduring the present. Maria proved invaluable in the preparations, her knowledge of travel in harsh conditions evident in every suggestion she made. She showed Ben how to layer blankets for maximum warmth, how to pack food that wouldn't freeze, how to arrange their supplies so they'd be easy to reach without unpacking everything. You've done this before, Ben observed as she efficiently organized their provisions. Many times. Apache people move with the seasons, follow the game, find the best camping spots. My husband taught me much about traveling safely before he died. What happened to him? Ben asked, then immediately regretted the question. Sorry, that's not my business. It is if we are to travel together, to trust each other, Maria said calmly. He was killed in a skirmish with cavalry soldiers 2 years ago. Not a battle, not a war, just young men with guns who saw enemies instead of people. I'm sorry, Ben said, and meant it. He was a good man, a good father for the short time he had with Small Bear. But he is gone, and I am here, and my son needs a future that his father cannot give him. As darkness fell, they loaded the sleigh with careful precision. Small Bear was wrapped in layers of warm cloth and furs, nestled in a basket that would protect him from the wind and cold. Ben had packed his rifle and ammunition, while Maria carried her knives and a small pouch of traditional medicines. If we meet other travelers on the road, Ben said as he hitched his strongest horse to the sleigh, you're my sister-in-law, come to help with a sick baby. Keep the story simple. And if we meet Jake Morrison and his men? Ben's jaw tightened. Then we fight our way through. But hopefully they're still licking their wounds and planning their next move. The night was clear and cold, stars brilliant in the thin air. The horse's breath created clouds of steam as they began the journey toward Millfield, the sleigh runners cutting smooth tracks through the snow. Small Bear slept peacefully in his basket, warm and secure between his mother and the man who'd become his unlikely protector. For the first hour, they traveled in comfortable silence, both of them listening for sounds of pursuit, watching for signs that they weren't alone on the winter roads. But the night remained peaceful, filled only with the whisper of runners on snow and the steady rhythm of the horses' hooves. Ben, Maria said finally, her voice soft in the darkness. What you did today, standing up to those men, fighting beside me, it was not something you had to do. You could have given Small Bear to them and returned to your quiet life. Wouldn't have been much of a life, Ben replied. And anyway, I told you. I couldn't save my own family, but maybe I could save yours. You did save us. Both of us. And now I want to ask you something. Ben waited, sensing the importance of whatever she was about to say. When this is over, when Small Bear is safe and the immediate danger has passed, would you consider staying? Not just protecting us, but being part of our family? Helping me raise him, teach him, show him what it means to be a good man in a difficult world? The question took Ben's breath away. 3 years of loneliness had taught him to expect nothing, hope for nothing, plan for nothing beyond simple survival. Now this remarkable woman was offering him something he'd thought was gone forever, the chance to be needed, to matter, to build something meaningful with his life. Maria, he said slowly, I'm not sure I remember how to be part of a family anymore. Grief has a way of making you forget things like that. Then we will remember together, she said simply. Small Bear will teach us both, I think. Children have a way of showing adults what really matters. Ben looked over at the sleeping baby, so small and vulnerable, yet somehow strong enough to bridge the gap between two broken people, two different worlds, two hearts that had learned to expect nothing but loss. Yes, he said finally. I'd like that very much. The words seemed to release something in both of them, a tension neither had realized they'd been carrying. The future was still uncertain, still dangerous, but it was no longer empty. They had each other now, and they had Small Bear, and sometimes that was enough to build a life on. The lights of Millfield appeared in the distance like stars fallen to earth, welcoming and warm in the cold night. Whatever waited for them there, whatever challenges lay ahead, they would face them together. It was more than any of them had dared hope for just a few days ago, and it felt like a miracle disguised as simple human decency. As they approached the outskirts of town, Small Bear stirred in his basket and made soft, contented sounds, as if he approved of the direction their lives were taking. For the first time since Sarah's death, Ben Carter allowed himself to believe that tomorrow might be better than today, and that was enough to carry them all through whatever darkness still lay ahead. Doc Richardson's house sat at the edge of Millfield like a lighthouse, its windows glowing warm against the winter darkness. Ben had always appreciated that about the old physician, how he kept his lamps burning late into the night so folks would know they could come to him with their troubles regardless of the hour. Tonight, that welcoming light felt like salvation. They pulled the sleigh up to the hitching post behind the house, away from the main street where curious eyes might see them arriving together. Small Bear had awakened during the final mile of their journey, fussing softly but not crying outright, as if he understood the need for discretion. Let me go first, Ben said, stepping down from the sleigh. Make sure he's alone, that we're not walking into trouble. Maria nodded, gathering Small Bear closer to her chest. She'd wrapped herself in Ben's heavy coat for the journey, and in the darkness she could pass for a white woman if no one looked too closely. It was a small deception, but one that might buy them the few moments they needed to explain their situation. Ben knocked on the back door, 3 sharp raps followed by 2 softer ones. It was an old signal from his cavalry days, something Doc Richardson would recognize as meaning friend in need of help. The door opened almost immediately, revealing a tall, thin man with wire-rimmed spectacles and the permanently stained fingers of someone who spent his days mixing medicines. Ben Carter, Doc Richardson said, surprise evident in his voice. Haven't seen you in town for months. What brings you out in weather like this? Got a situation, Doc. Need your help. With something that might be complicated. Doc Richardson's expression grew serious. He'd been practicing medicine on the frontier long enough to know that complicated usually meant dangerous, and that men like Ben Carter didn't ask for help unless they were truly desperate. Come in, come in. Both of you, he added, having spotted Maria's silhouette in the sleigh. Whatever it is, we'll sort it out by the fire. The interior of Doc Richardson's house was warm and cluttered, filled with the organized chaos of a man who collected medical books, scientific instruments, and wounded creatures in equal measure. A tabby cat looked up from its perch near the fireplace, studied the newcomers with feline indifference, then returned to its grooming. "Now then," Doc Richardson said, settling his spectacles more firmly on his nose, "what's this about?" Ben looked at Maria, who nodded encouragingly. They'd agreed on the journey that honesty was their best strategy with Doc Richardson. The old physician had seen enough of frontier life to understand that situations weren't always black and white. "Found a baby 3 nights ago," Ben began. "Nearly frozen to death in my barn during that blizzard. Apache baby, about 6 months old." Doc Richardson's eyebrows rose slightly, but his expression remained professionally neutral. "And the child is here," Maria said, stepping forward and gently unwrapping Small Bear from his blankets. "This is my son. His name is Small Bear." The doctor moved closer, his trained eye taking in the baby's color, his breathing, his general appearance. "May I?" he asked, extending his hands. Maria hesitated for only a moment before passing Small Bear to the physician. Doc Richardson handled the infant with the practiced ease of someone who delivered dozens of babies and treated hundreds more. "Well fed, well cared for," he murmured, running gentle fingers over Small Bear's limbs, checking his reflexes and responses. "No signs of malnutrition or abuse. Whoever's been looking after him has done excellent work." "That would be Ben," Maria said quietly. "He saved my son's life." Doc Richardson glanced between them, understanding beginning to dawn in his intelligent eyes. "I see, and I'm guessing there are people who aren't too happy about that arrangement. Jake Morrison and some of his friends paid me a visit this morning," Ben said grimly. "Made their feelings on the subject pretty clear." "Ah," Doc Richardson continued his examination of Small Bear, who was gurgling contentedly and trying to grab the physician's spectacles. "And you came to me because?" "Because you're the only doctor in 50 miles, Maria said. "And because Ben says you're a good man who cares more about healing than politics." "Flattery will get you everywhere," Doc Richardson said dryly, but there was warmth in his voice. "The child appears to be in excellent health, all things considered. A bit thin, perhaps, but that's to be expected given his recent experiences. No signs of frostbite or serious illness." He handed Small Bear back to Maria, who accepted him with visible relief. "The question is, what do you want me to do about the situation? Because I'm assuming you didn't brave a winter night just for a medical opinion." Ben and Maria exchanged glances. They'd discussed this during the journey, but now that the moment was here, neither was sure how to proceed. "We need somewhere safe to stay," Ben said finally. "At least until we can figure out our next move. My ranch is too isolated, too easy for Morrison and his men to surround." "And going back to your people isn't an option?" Doc Richardson asked. "Maria, not with Small Bear," she replied. "My people would protect us, but they would also expect me to raise him to hate all whites, to see Ben as an enemy. I won't do that to my son." "So you're caught between two worlds, neither of which wants to accept you," Doc Richardson mused. "It's an old story in this territory, though not usually with such high stakes." Small Bear chose that moment to let out a healthy wail, demanding attention with the imperious tone that only babies could achieve. Maria automatically began bouncing him gently, making soft, soothing sounds that seemed to calm him immediately. "He's hungry," she said. "It's been several hours since his last feeding." "I've got cow's milk," Doc Richardson offered, "and some other supplies that might be useful." As Maria prepared to feed Small Bear, Doc Richardson pulled Ben aside, his expression serious. "Ben, I need you to understand what you're getting into here," he said quietly. "Jake Morrison isn't going to let this go. He's got political ambitions. Thinks stirring up anti-Apache sentiment will get him elected to the territorial legislature. Having a white rancher harboring an Apache woman and child undermines his entire narrative. So what are you saying? That I should hand them over? To keep the peace? I'm saying that the peace was broken long before you found that baby, Doc Richardson replied. The question is whether you're prepared for what comes next. Because this won't end with Jake Morrison backing down. It'll end with someone dead. Probably several someones. Ben looked across the room at Maria, who was feeding Small Bear with the patient attention that mothers everywhere gave to their children. She'd already lost a husband to the violence that plagued the territory. She'd almost lost her son. Now she was trusting Ben to help her build something better, something that could survive in a world that seemed determined to destroy it. Doc, Ben said slowly, 3 years ago I thought my life was over. Thought there was nothing left worth fighting for. But that baby changed something in me. And Maria, she's shown me that maybe it's possible to build bridges instead of walls. Noble sentiments, Doc Richardson said. But bridges don't stop bullets. No, but maybe they can stop the people firing them. Maybe if folks saw that Apache and white could work together, could care for each other's children, it might change some minds. Doc Richardson was quiet for a long moment, studying Ben's face in the firelight. Finally he nodded slowly. You can stay here tonight, he said. I've got a spare room upstairs, and nobody pays much attention to my comings and goings. But tomorrow, you'll need a more permanent solution. Any suggestions? Actually, yes. There's a family about 20 miles north of here, the Garcias. Mexican settlers who've been farming the same land for 30 years. They've had their own troubles with Jake Morrison's type, and they don't much care for territorial politics. More importantly, they've got children of their own and understand what it means to protect a family. You think they'd be willing to help? I think Miguel Garcia owes me a favor or two, and he's the kind of man who pays his debts. More than that, his wife Elena has a soft spot for children in need. Lost 2 of her own to scarlet fever a few years back. Ben felt a flicker of hope. And you'd be willing to make the introduction? More than that. I'll travel with you. Make it clear that this has my professional endorsement. Elena Garcia will listen to my medical opinion about what's best for the child. Across the room, Small Bear had finished eating and was now making the soft, sleepy sounds that preceded an infant's descent into slumber. Maria was singing to him quietly, a lilting Apache lullaby that seemed to fill the room with peace despite the danger that surrounded them. There's something else you should know, Doc Richardson said, his voice dropping even lower. Word's already spreading about what happened at your ranch today. By tomorrow, half the territory will know that Ben Carter fought alongside an Apache woman against Jake Morrison's men. How could word spread that fast? Pete Hawkins. Soon as he got back to town, he went straight to the saloon and started talking. Now Pete's not a bad man, just scared and confused, but he's got a loose tongue when he's been drinking. Ben cursed under his breath. What's he saying? That you've gone native, that you're harboring Apache hostiles. That Small Bear, there's actually a white child stolen in a raid, and you're helping return him to his captors. That's ridiculous. Anyone who looks at the baby can see he's Apache. Doesn't matter. Facts have a way of getting twisted when they serve people's purposes. Jake Morrison's probably already working on his version of events, making himself the hero and you the villain. Maria had noticed their whispered conversation and approached them, Small Bear now sleeping peacefully in her arms. Is there a problem? She asked. Ben explained what Doc Richardson had told him about Pete Hawkins and the spreading rumors. Maria listened without comment, her expression growing more serious as she understood the implications. So we are all ready. Marked as enemies, she said when Ben finished. There's no neutral ground left. There might be, Doc Richardson interjected. If we move quickly, if we can get you to the Garcia place before Morrison has time to organize a larger posse. Miguel Garcia's got his own men, vaqueros who've been with him for years. They're loyal, and they're good in a fight if it comes to that. And if Garcia won't help us? Ben asked. Then you keep moving until you find someone who will. The territory's bigger than Jake Morrison's influence, and there are good people scattered throughout it. People who understand that a baby's life is worth more than political posturing. Small Bear stirred in Maria's arms, making soft sounds of contentment. Looking down at him, Ben felt the same fierce protectiveness that had driven him to fight Jake Morrison's men earlier that day. This child had become more than just a foundling he'd rescued. He'd become a symbol of everything Ben hoped to build. From the wreckage of his old life. We'll go to the Garcias, Ben decided. All of us together. Doc Richardson nodded approvingly. I'll make arrangements. We can leave at first light, take the back trails to avoid main roads. My medical bag will give us an excuse if we meet anyone along the way. And after that? Maria asked. After we reach this Garcia family? What then? Then we see if it's possible to build something new in this territory, Ben said. Something that doesn't depend on hatred and fear. Something that a child like Small Bear can grow up in without having to choose between his Apache heritage and his place in the white world. That's asking a lot of people who've been enemies for generations, Doc Richardson observed. Maybe it's time to ask a lot, Ben replied. Maybe that's the only way anything's going to change. Outside, the wind had picked up again, whistling around the corners of Doc Richardson's house and rattling the windows. But inside, warmed by the fire and the presence of people committed to protecting an innocent child, the three adults began planning for a future that none of them could have imagined just a few days earlier. Small Bear slept on, unaware of the complexities surrounding his young life, trusting in the love and protection of the adults who'd claimed him as their own. In his peaceful slumber, he represented something precious and fragile, the possibility that love could triumph over hate, that understanding could bridge the gap between different worlds, and that sometimes the most important battles were fought, not with guns and violence, but with simple human decency and the courage to do what was right regardless of the cost. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new dangers, and new opportunities to either build bridges or burn them down. But tonight, in the warm sanctuary of a country doctor's home, three people who'd found each other against all odds allowed themselves to hope that love might be stronger than the forces trying to tear them apart. Dawn came gray and cold, with fresh snow beginning to fall as Doc Richardson hitched his medical wagon for the journey to the Garcia ranch. Ben helped load supplies while Maria fed Small Bear, who seemed remarkably untroubled by the early hour, and the preparations for another day of travel. Weather's turning again, Doc Richardson observed, checking the harness one final time. Might work in our favor, though. Harder for Morrison's men to track us if our trail gets covered by snow. Ben nodded, though privately he wondered if they were trading one danger for another. Getting caught in a blizzard with a baby could be just as deadly as facing Jake Morrison's guns, but at least the weather wasn't actively trying to kill them. They'd spent the night taking turns on watch, though the town had remained quiet. Doc Richardson's house sat far enough from the main street that casual observers wouldn't notice their presence, but all three adults understood that their time was limited. By full daylight, someone would spot them, and word would reach Jake. Morrison within hours, ready? Maria asked, emerging from the house with Small Bear wrapped securely against her chest. She'd fashioned a carrier from one of Doc Richardson's blankets, binding the baby close to her body in the traditional Apache style. As we'll ever be, Ben replied, helping her up onto the wagon seat. Doc, you sure about this? It's not too late for you to stay out of it. Ben, I've been patching up the victims of this territory's violence for 15 years, Doc Richardson said as he climbed onto the driver's seat. Maybe it's time I did something to prevent some of that violence instead of just treating its aftermath. They pulled away from Millfield just as the church bell was ringing 6 o'clock, the sound muffled by the falling snow. The main street was empty, except for a few early risers heading to work, none of whom paid particular attention to the doctor's wagon heading north out of town. For the first hour, they made good time on the well-traveled road that connected Millfield to the farming communities in the northern valley. But as they turned onto the smaller trail that led to the Garcia ranch, the going became more difficult. The snow was deeper here, less packed by traffic, and Doc Richardson's horse had to work harder to pull the wagon through the drifts. "How much farther?" Ben asked, scanning the landscape for signs of pursuit. "Another 10 miles, maybe 12, Doc Richardson replied. "The Garcia place sits in a valley between two mesas. Good water, good grazing, and defensible if it comes." To that, Small Bear had been sleeping peacefully, but now he began to stir and fuss. Maria automatically began the gentle swaying motion that seemed to soothe him, humming softly under her breath. "He's been so good through all of this," she said. "Almost like he knows we're trying to help him. Babies are tougher than people." "Give them credit for," Doc Richardson observed. "I've seen infants survive things that would break grown men. They've got a will to live that's purely instinctive." "His father was like that," Maria said quietly. "Never gave up, never stopped. Fighting, even when the odds were against him. I see that same spirit in Small Bear." Ben found himself watching Maria as she spoke about her late husband, noting the way her voice softened with memory but didn't break with grief. She'd loved the man, that was clear, but she'd also made peace with his loss in a way that Ben was still learning to do with Sarah's death. "What was he like?" Ben asked. "Your husband?" Maria was quiet for a moment, considering the question. "Strong, gentle with me and fierce with his enemies. He believed that Apache people could find a way to live alongside whites without losing who we were. Some of our people thought he was naive, but I think he was just hopeful. Sounds like a good man." "He was. And he would have liked you. I think he always said that courage showed itself in small actions, not just grand gestures. What you did for Small Bear, that was the kind of courage he respected." The compliment warmed Ben more than he'd expected. For 3 years, he'd thought of himself as a coward, someone who'd failed when it mattered most. But Maria's words suggested a different interpretation of his actions, one that allowed for the possibility that he might be worthy of the trust she was placing in him. They crested a small rise and found themselves looking down into a valley that seemed untouched by the conflicts raging elsewhere in the territory. The Garcia ranch spread across the valley floor like something from a peaceful dream, with fields marked by neat stone walls, a substantial adobe house with smoke rising from its chimney, and outbuildings that spoke of prosperity earned through hard work. "Beautiful," Maria breathed, and Ben could hear the longing in her voice. Here was what they were all searching for, a place where children could grow up safely, where different peoples could work together, where the future might be built on cooperation rather than conflict. "Miguel's done well for himself," Doc Richardson said with evident pride. "When he first came here, this was nothing but rocks and scrub brush. Everything you see, he built with his own hands and the help of good friends." As they descended into the valley, Ben could see people working around the ranch buildings, tending to animals and maintaining equipment with the steady rhythm of an established community. Several riders emerged from the main house, approaching their wagon with the cautious alertness of people who'd learned to be careful about unexpected visitors. The lead rider was a man in his 50s, solidly built with graying hair and intelligent eyes that missed nothing. He rode with the easy confidence of someone completely at home in the saddle, and when he spoke, his voice carried the authority of a man accustomed to command. "Doc Richardson," he called out in accented English, "this is an unexpected pleasure, though I hope no one is injured." "Hello, Miguel," Doc Richardson replied, bringing the wagon to a stop. "No injuries, but I do have some people here who could use your help." Miguel Garcia's eyes moved from Ben to Maria to the bundle that was obviously a baby, and his expression grew thoughtful. Like most successful frontier settlers, he'd learned to read situations quickly and accurately. "Perhaps we should continue this conversation inside," he said diplomatically. "Elena has coffee on, and it's warmer by the fire." The Garcia house was spacious and comfortable, built in the traditional adobe style that stayed cool in summer and warm in winter. Elena Garcia met them at the door, a woman in her 40s with kind eyes and hands that spoke of a lifetime of hard work. She took one look at Maria holding small bear and immediately moved into the maternal mode that seemed universal among frontier women. "Bring that baby to the fire," she said, her English heavily accented but warmly welcoming. "He must be cold from the journey." The next hour passed in explanations as Ben and Maria told their story to Miguel and Elena Garcia, while Doc Richardson provided medical context and character references. The Garcia family listened without interruption as Ben and Maria recounted the events of the past few days. Miguel's weathered hands wrapped around his coffee cup, his dark eyes never leaving their faces as he absorbed every detail. Elena sat closer to Maria, occasionally reaching out to touch Small Bear's tiny hand with the instinctive tenderness of a woman who understood the preciousness of children. When the story concluded, silence settled over the room like dust after a windstorm. Miguel stood and walked to the window, looking out at his valley with the expression of a man calculating risks and possibilities. Elena continued to study Small Bear, who was awake now and looking around with the bright curiosity of a healthy infant. "This Jake Morrison," Miguel said finally, his voice thoughtful. "He has been trouble for many people in this territory. Not just Apache, but anyone who doesn't fit his idea of what belongs here." "You've had dealings with him?" Ben asked. 3 years ago, he tried to claim water rights to the creek that runs through my land. Said Mexican settlers had no business controlling resources that American citizens needed. When I showed him the legal papers proving my ownership, he suggested that papers could be lost, that accidents could happen to people who didn't understand their place. Elena's expression darkened. He brought men with guns to make his point. But Miguel has friends too, and we made it clear that this family would not be intimidated. "The problem is that Morrison has grown bolder since then," Miguel continued. "He's convinced the territorial government that he represents law and order, that anyone who opposes him is a threat to American interests. Having a white rancher protecting an Apache woman and child will be seen as the ultimate betrayal in his eyes." Doc Richardson leaned forward. "Which is why they need somewhere safe to stay while we figure out a more permanent solution. I was hoping you might be willing to help." Miguel and Elena exchanged a long look, the kind of silent communication that developed between couples who'd faced hardship together. When Elena nodded slightly, Miguel turned back to their guests. "Of course you can stay," he said simply. "Any enemy of Jake Morrison is a friend of ours. But I need you to understand what you're asking. This won't end with Morrison giving up and going home. He'll bring more men, more pressure, more threats. Are you prepared for that?" Ben looked at Maria, who was gently rocking Small Bear in her arms. The baby was reaching for a strand of her hair, his tiny fingers grasping at the black silk with determined concentration. The sight of them together, mother and child united after desperate separation, filled Ben with a certainty he hadn't felt in years. "We're prepared," he said. "All of us." "Then welcome to our home," Elena said, standing to embrace Maria carefully, mindful of the baby between them. "Small Bear will be safe here, and so will both of you." The next few days passed in a peaceful routine that felt almost too good to be true. Miguel's ranch operated like a small village, with families living in various buildings around the main house and everyone contributing to the common welfare. Children played in the courtyards while adults worked at the 1,000 tasks that kept a frontier community functioning. Maria proved invaluable, her knowledge of traditional medicine complementing Doc Richardson's modern techniques as they tended to various ailments among the ranch families. She showed Alina how to prepare poultices from desert plants, while Alina taught her the secrets of managing a large household with limited resources. Ben found himself working alongside Miguel's vaqueros, men who accepted him without question. Once they understood he was under the family's protection, the physical labor felt good after years of solitary ranch work, and he discovered that his grief was easier to bear when shared with others who understood loss and hardship. Small Bear thrived in the environment, surrounded by other children who found his presence delightful rather than threatening. Alina's youngest daughter, Carmen, appointed herself his special guardian, singing to him in Spanish and bringing him small gifts of smooth stones and colorful feathers. "He's going to grow up speaking 3 languages," Maria observed one evening, as they sat around the fire: Apache, Spanish, and English. "He'll be able to bridge worlds in ways his father and I never imagined." "That's what this territory needs," Miguel said. "Children who can see beyond the divisions that keep adults at war with each other." But their peaceful interlude couldn't last forever. On the 5th day, one of Miguel's sentries rode in with news that sent tension racing through the ranch like wildfire. "Riders coming from the south," he reported. 20 men, maybe more. Armed and moving with purpose. Miguel's face hardened. "Morrison. Has to be," Ben agreed, checking his rifle. He's had time to gather support, spread his version of what happened. "We have advantages they don't," Miguel said calmly. "We know this land, we have defensive positions, and we're fighting for our homes and families. They're fighting for one man's political ambitions." Elena had already begun organizing the other women and children, moving them to the most secure buildings and preparing supplies for what might be a prolonged siege. Maria strapped Small Bear to her chest in his carrier, ensuring her hands would be free if fighting erupted. "You don't have to do this," Ben told her. "You and Small Bear could hide in the root cellar until it's over." "We are a family now," Maria replied firmly. "Families stand together." The word family hit Ben with unexpected force. Somewhere in the past few days, that's exactly what they'd become. Not through blood or marriage, but through shared commitment to protecting something precious and innocent. Small Bear had become their son, their future, their reason for hoping that the world could be better than it was. Jake Morrison's force appeared on the ridge overlooking the valley just as the sun reached its zenith. Even at a distance, Ben could see the glint of weapons and the aggressive posture of men who'd come for violence. Morrison himself was easily recognizable, sitting his horse like a general surveying a battlefield. "Ben Carter." Morrison's voice carried across the valley, amplified by the natural acoustics of the surrounding mesas. "We know you're down there. Come out and face justice for your crimes." Miguel stepped out of the main house, his own rifle in his hands. "This is my land, Morrison. State your business or move along." "Your business too now, Miguel. Harboring fugitives makes you an accessory to treason." "The only fugitives I see are the men who attacked a peaceful ranch and threatened a baby's life." The exchange continued for several minutes, voices echoing off the valley walls as both sides stated their positions. It was clear that negotiation was impossible. Morrison had come for blood, and he wouldn't leave without it. "Last chance, Ben," Morrison called. "Send out the Apache woman and her brat, and maybe we'll let the rest of you live." Ben stepped into the open, his rifle at ready but not yet aimed. "Jake, you know me. You know I'm not a traitor or a criminal. I'm just a man trying to do right by a child who needed help. That's not a child, it's a future warrior who'll grow up to kill white families. You're not protecting innocence, you're nurturing an enemy." "All I see is a baby who nearly died in a blizzard," Ben replied. "All I did was keep him alive. Until his mother could find him. If that makes me a traitor, then I'm proud to be one." Morrison's response was to signal his men. The attack began with a volley of rifle fire that sent splinters flying from the ranch buildings and drove the defenders to cover. But Miguel's people were ready, and they returned fire with the disciplined accuracy of men and women who'd learned to shoot for survival rather than sport. The battle raged for hours, with Morrison's men trying to advance down the slope while the defenders held them back from prepared positions. Ben found himself fighting alongside Maria. Their earlier partnership against the Fletcher brothers now expanded into something larger and more desperate. "They're trying to circle around." "To the north," Maria observed, pointing to movement among the rocks. "If they reach the barn, they'll have a clear shot at the main house." "I see them," Ben replied, adjusting his aim. "Miguel's got men there, but they're spread thin." Small Bear had remained remarkably calm throughout the fighting, as if he understood that the adults around him were working to keep him safe. When bullets came too close, Maria would shield him with her body, but she never stopped fighting, never stopped contributing to their defense. As the sun began to set, it became clear that Morrison's assault was failing. His men were taking casualties without gaining ground, and the defenders seemed capable of holding their positions indefinitely. More importantly, word of the attack had spread to other ranches in the valley, and reinforcements were arriving to help the Garcia family. "This isn't over, Ben," Morrison called out as his men began to withdraw. "You've made yourself an enemy of every decent person in this territory." "Maybe," Ben called back, "but I've made myself a friend to everyone who believes children deserve protection regardless of their blood." The withdrawal turned into a rout as Morrison's demoralized men fled back toward the main road. Several had been wounded, and all had been shaken by the fierce resistance they'd encountered. This wasn't the easy victory they'd expected, but a hard-fought battle against people willing to die for their beliefs. As darkness fell and the last of the attackers disappeared into the distance, the defenders began to assess the damage. Buildings had been shot up, some animals had been wounded, but miraculously, no one had been killed. The Garcia Ranch had survived its first major test as a refuge for those seeking something better than the endless cycle of violence that plagued the territory. "It's not over," Miguel said as they gathered around the fire to tend wounds and share food. "Morrison will be back, probably with more men and better organization. Then we'll be ready for him," Ben replied. "And next time, we'll have even more people who understand what we're fighting for." Doc Richardson, who'd spent the battle tending to the wounded rather than fighting, looked up from bandaging a vaquero's arm. "You know, there's something poetic about this. An Apache woman, a grieving rancher, and a Mexican family united in defense of a child. It's like a symbol of what this territory could become if more people chose cooperation over conflict." Maria, who was nursing Small Bear in the corner, smiled at the observation. "My grandmother used to say that the future belonged to those who could see beyond the fears of the present. Maybe Small Bear's generation will be the one that finally builds the bridges we're fighting to protect." As the weeks passed, the Garcia Ranch became a beacon for others seeking refuge from the violence and hatred that seemed to define frontier life. Word spread of the place where Apache and Mexican and white families worked together, where children played regardless of their heritage, where the future was being built one small act of kindness at a time. Small Bear grew and thrived in this environment, his laughter becoming a daily reminder of why they'd chosen to stand against the forces of division. He took his first steps in the Garcia courtyard, applauded by children who spoke 3 languages, and adults who'd learned that family was defined by love rather than blood. Ben found himself changed by the experience in ways he couldn't have imagined. The grief that had consumed him for 3 years began to transform into something else: purpose, hope, and a deep commitment to ensuring that Small Bear and children like him would inherit a better world. His love for Maria grew naturally from their shared experiences, built on mutual respect and common goals rather than desperate need. Maria, for her part, discovered that her choice to trust a grieving rancher with her son's life had opened doors she'd never expected. The Garcia Ranch became not just a refuge, but a new kind of home, one where her Apache heritage was valued rather than feared, where Small Bear could learn about both his parents' worlds without having to choose between them. When spring arrived, and the snows melted, revealing the full beauty of the valley, the little community had grown to include families from all backgrounds. Jake Morrison's political ambitions had been damaged by his failed assault on the ranch, and more moderate voices were beginning to emerge in territorial politics. The future remained uncertain, but it no longer seemed hopeless. One evening, as Ben sat on the porch watching Small Bear play with the other children, Maria joined him with the quiet contentment of a woman who'd found her place in the world. "Do you ever regret it?" she asked. "Giving up your isolated grief for all this complexity?" Ben considered the question, watching as Small Bear toddled across the courtyard toward them with his arms outstretched. The baby had started calling him Papa Ben in his mixture of Apache and English, a title that had initially startled Ben, but now filled him with pride. "Never," he said simply. "Grief is a cold companion. Love is much warmer." Maria smiled and slipped her hand into his, their fingers intertwining as they watched their son navigate the world with the fearless curiosity that defined childhood. Around them, the sounds of the ranch settling into evening filled the air. Laughter, conversation, the gentle lowing of cattle, and the promise of tomorrow. Small Bear reached them and pulled himself up on Ben's leg, babbling happily in his own private language. Ben lifted him into his lap, and Maria leaned against his shoulder, and for a moment, the three of them sat in perfect peace, surrounded by the community they'd helped build and the future they'd fought to protect. The stars were beginning to appear in the darkening sky, and Ben found himself thinking about Sarah and the son he'd never had the chance to raise. The pain was still there, would always be there, but it no longer defined him. Instead, he'd found a way to honor their memory. By protecting and loving another child, by building the family that tragedy had taken from him. "Thank you," he whispered to the night sky, though he wasn't sure if he was addressing Sarah, God, or the mysterious forces that had brought a frozen baby to his barn on a winter night. Maria heard him and understood without explanation. She'd learned to read the rhythms of his grief, just as he'd learned to respect the strength that carried her through loss and uncertainty. They'd both been broken by life, but they'd found a way to heal together, to create something beautiful from the fragments of their shattered dreams. Small Bear fell asleep in Ben's arms, his breathing soft and regular, his small hand curled around his father's finger. In the distance, other children were being called in for the night, their voices echoing off the valley walls with the music of innocence and hope. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities to choose between fear and love, between division and unity. But tonight, under the vast Arizona sky, a family that had been forged in conflict and strengthened by shared purpose, allowed themselves to believe that they'd helped plant seeds that would grow into something magnificent. The wind rustled through the cottonwoods that lined the creek, carrying with it the scent of desert flowers and the promise of rain. In the Garcia Ranch, children of different backgrounds slept peacefully in their beds, dreaming of a world where such differences were celebrated rather than feared. And in the main house, three people who'd found each other against all odds planned for a future that seemed suddenly, miraculously possible. The frozen baby who'd been left to die in a rancher's barn had become the catalyst for something much larger, a demonstration that love could triumph over hatred, that families could be built from courage and compassion, and that sometimes the most important battles were won not with weapons, but with the simple act of refusing to let fear dictate the terms of human connection. As the stars wheeled overhead and the night deepened around them, Ben Carter held his son close and knew that Sarah would have been proud of the man he'd become, the family he'd chosen, and the future he was helping to build. The grief would always be part of him, but it no longer controlled him. He'd found his way back to the light, guided by the love of a remarkable woman and the trust of a child who needed someone to believe in the possibility of hope. In the end, that's all any of them could do. Believe in hope, protect it when it was threatened, and pass it on to the next generation with the prayer that they would prove worthy of the gift. The frozen baby had become a symbol of that hope, and the family that had formed around him was proof that sometimes miracles came disguised as ordinary human decency. The story of the widowed rancher and the Apache mother would be told for generations in the valley, a reminder that the most important choices were often the smallest ones, and that the future belonged to those brave enough to choose love over fear, no matter the cost. 6 months after the battle at the Garcia Ranch, Ben Carter stood in the doorway of his rebuilt home, watching Small Bear chase butterflies through Sarah's garden. The boy moved with the confident stride of a toddler who'd learned to walk surrounded by love and encouragement, his laughter echoing across the valley like a promise that joy could survive even in the harshest places. The ranch looked different now, transformed from a monument to grief into something alive and purposeful. Maria had insisted on expanding Sarah's vegetable garden, adding traditional Apache plants alongside the familiar crops. The result was a riot of color and texture that attracted birds and insects from across the territory, creating an oasis of life where before there had been only memory. New buildings dotted the landscape, homes for the families who'd come seeking the same refuge that Ben and Maria had found at the Garcia Ranch. Word had spread through both Apache and Mexican communities about the place where different peoples worked together, where children played without regard to the color of their skin or the language of their parents. Miguel Garcia had become more than an ally. He'd become family in the truest sense. His eldest son, Roberto, had married Elena's niece in a ceremony that blended Apache, Mexican, and American traditions, creating something entirely new while honoring all three heritages. The wedding had been attended by people from across the territory, many of whom had never seen such cooperation between different cultures. Doc Richardson visited regularly, bringing medical supplies and news from the outside world. Jake Morrison's political career had collapsed after his failed attack on the Garcia Ranch, and more moderate voices were emerging in territorial politics. There was talk of statehood, of laws that would protect the rights of all residents regardless of their heritage. "Ben," Maria called from the kitchen, her voice carrying the warmth that had become the soundtrack of his daily life. "Small Bear needs his afternoon rest, and we have visitors coming." Ben scooped up the protesting toddler, who discovered that butterflies were much more interesting than naps. Small Bear had grown into a beautiful child with his mother's dark eyes and quick intelligence, but also something uniquely his own, an ability to bring people together simply by being himself. "Papa Ben, more play," Small Bear demanded at his mixture of Apache, Spanish, and English. The boy switched between languages as easily as he switched between toys, treating each one as a natural part of his world. "After your nap, little warrior," Ben replied, using the Apache phrase Maria had taught him. "The butterflies will still be here when you wake up." As Ben settled Small Bear in his crib, he marveled at how naturally fatherhood had come to him. The child wasn't his by blood, but the connection between them was as strong as any biological bond. Small Bear had been there for Ben's transformation from grieving widower to family man, and Ben had been there for every milestone in the boy's young life. The visitors Maria had mentioned turned out to be a delegation from the territorial capital, including 2 men in expensive suits and a woman whose bearing suggested she was accustomed to authority. Ben recognized one of the men as Judge Harrison, a fair-minded jurist who'd gained a reputation for even-handed treatment of all territorial residents. "Mr. Carter," Judge Harrison said, extending his hand, "I've been looking forward to meeting you. Your story has reached the capital, and there are people there who believe you represent something important for our territory's future." The woman stepped forward, her eyes taking in the ranch with obvious approval. I'm Catherine Walsh from the Bureau of Indian Affairs. I've been tasked with studying successful examples of cooperation between different communities. Your ranch has become something of a model. Ben felt uncomfortable with the attention, but Maria appeared at his side with the quiet confidence that had helped him navigate countless difficult situations. "Welcome to our home," she said simply. "Small Bear is sleeping, but perhaps you'd like to see what we've built here." The tour that followed revealed the extent of their success. The ranch now supported 15 families from various backgrounds, all working together toward common goals. Children attended school in a building that had been constructed using Apache engineering techniques and Mexican craftsmanship, taught by a teacher who spoke all 3 languages fluently. The crops they grew fed not only their own community, but also supplied food to towns throughout the region. Their horses were sought after for their strength and intelligence, bred using techniques that combined Apache knowledge with Mexican vaquero traditions and American ranching methods. "This is remarkable," Catherine Walsh observed as they watched children playing together in the schoolyard. "I've never seen such integration work so smoothly. What's your secret?" Maria and Ben exchanged a glance, the kind of silent communication that had developed between them over months of shared challenges and victories. "We started with a child who needed help," Ben said finally. "Everything else grew from that. When you focus on what's best for children, the rest tends to fall into place. And we never forgot that we were all outsiders once," Maria added. "Apache people who'd lost their traditional lands, Mexicans dealing with new borders, white settlers far from their families. We all understood what it meant to need acceptance." Judge Harrison nodded thoughtfully. "There's been discussion in the Capitol about creating official policies to encourage this kind of cooperation. Would you be willing to advise such efforts?" "Our advice would be simple," Ben replied. "Don't try to force it from the top down. It has to grow naturally, from people who genuinely want to build something better together." That evening, after the visitors had departed with promises to stay in touch, Ben and Maria sat on their porch watching Small Bear toddle around the yard under the watchful eye of Carmen Garcia, who'd appointed herself his permanent guardian. "And playmate, do you think we've really changed anything?" Maria asked, her hand finding his as they watched their son explore his world with fearless curiosity. "Look around," Ben replied, gesturing toward the lights beginning to appear in windows across their community. "Every family here represents someone who chose hope over fear, cooperation over conflict. If that's not change, I don't know what is." Small Bear had discovered a cricket and was following it with the intense concentration that only small children could bring to such pursuits. Carmen was explaining something to him in rapid Spanish, her hands gesturing expressively as she shared the wisdom of her 7 years. "He'll grow up thinking this is normal," Maria observed. Different peoples working together, multiple languages in one household, solving problems through discussion instead of violence. That's his baseline for how the world should work. "Maybe that's the real victory," Ben said. "Not what we've accomplished, but what he'll expect from the world as he grows up." A rider approached through the gathering dusk, and Ben tensed automatically before recognizing Pete Hawkins. The old cavalry veteran had become a regular visitor to the ranch, drawn by curiosity that had gradually transformed into genuine respect for what they'd built. "Evening, folks," Pete called as he dismounted. "Brought some news from town you might want to hear." "Good news or bad news?" Ben asked, rising to greet him. "Bit of both, I reckon. Jake Morrison's left the territory for good, headed back east where his kind of politics might find a more receptive audience. That's the good news. And the bad news? There's talk of bringing in federal marshals to investigate what happened here. Some folks in Washington think there might be illegal activities happening, what with Apache and Mexicans and whites all mixed together like this." Maria's expression hardened. "What kind of illegal activities?" "Oh, the usual nonsense. Harboring fugitives, violating treaty obligations, corrupting American citizens with foreign influences." You know how it goes when politicians need someone to blame for their own failures. Ben felt the familiar weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders. Just when they'd thought they were safe, when their community was thriving, new threats emerged from unexpected directions. How much time do we have? He asked. Hard to say. Federal bureaucracy moves slow, but it moves. Could be months, could be a year. But you might want to start thinking about how to present yourselves when the time comes. After Pete left, Ben and Maria sat in silence for a long time, processing this new challenge. Small Bear had tired of cricket chasing and was now sitting in the grass, talking to himself in the private language that all children seem to develop. We could scatter, Maria said finally. Send families to different places, make it harder for them to target the whole community at once. Or we could stand our ground, Ben replied. Show them exactly what we've built here, let them see for themselves that there's nothing illegal or subversive about people working together. That's a big risk. Federal authorities have more power than Jake Morrison ever did. Maybe, but we've got something Morrison never had, the truth. And we've got people willing to speak that truth, including some with influence in the Capitol. Small Bear had made his way over to them and was now pulling himself up on Ben's leg, demanding attention with the imperious manner that only toddlers could achieve. Ben lifted him into his lap, and the boy immediately settled against his chest, with the complete trust that defined their relationship. What do you think, little warrior? Ben asked softly. Should we fight or should we run? Small Bear looked up at him with serious dark eyes, then pointed toward the lights of the community around them. Home, he said clearly, one of his favorite words in any language. He's right, Maria said, her voice gaining strength. This is home now for all of us. And you don't abandon home just because someone threatens it. Then we stand, Ben decided. Whatever comes, we face it together. The months that followed brought federal investigators, as Pete had predicted. But they also brought something unexpected, national attention, to what was happening in their remote corner of Arizona territory. Newspaper reporters arrived to document their story, followed by academics studying cooperative communities, and even a photographer who wanted to capture images of their integrated school. The investigators found no illegal activities, no violations of federal law, no evidence of the subversion they'd been told to expect. Instead, they found a thriving community that paid its taxes, followed all applicable regulations, and produced citizens who were more literate and prosperous than most frontier settlements. More importantly, they found Small Bear, now walking confidently and chattering in 3 languages, representing everything good about American opportunity and inclusion. The child who'd nearly died in the blizzard had become a symbol of what the territory could become when people chose cooperation over conflict. By his 2nd birthday, Small Bear was the center of a community that had grown to include over 100 residents from dozens of different backgrounds. The ranch had become a model for integration that was being studied and replicated across the West, proof that the American dream was big enough to include everyone willing to work for it. Ben stood in his garden that morning, watching Small Bear help Maria plant corn using techniques her grandmother had taught her. The boy was serious about his work, carefully placing each seed exactly where his mother showed him, his small hands gentle but determined. "Happy birthday, little warrior," Ben said, kneeling beside them in the rich earth that had been transformed from desert, hard pan into fertile soil through years of careful cultivation. Small Bear looked up and smiled, his face dirty and his eyes bright with joy. "Papa Ben, Mama, more seeds." And so they planted more seeds, in the garden and in the hearts of everyone who saw what love could accomplish when it was allowed to grow without boundaries. The frozen baby who'd been left to die had become the foundation for something magnificent, a demonstration that families could be built from courage and compassion, that communities could thrive on mutual respect, and that the future belonged to those brave enough to plant seeds of hope, even in the hardest ground. As they worked together in the morning sun, surrounded by the sounds of a community waking up to another day of shared purpose and mutual support, Ben Carter knew that Sarah would have been proud of the man he'd become, the family he'd chosen, and the legacy he was helping to build. The grief was still there, would always be there, but it had been transformed into something beautiful, a commitment to ensuring that no child would ever be abandoned to the cold if he had anything to say about it. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.